What's up, guys? It's Rey-Jay back with another video. And in this one, I want to talk about what's happening with SPY, Tesla, and the overall markets. Just remember that I am not a financial planner, so take nothing I say as financial advice. And also, if you guys can, please check out my Moomoo link. If you deposit $100, you're guaranteed 5 free stocks. If you deposit $1,000, you're guaranteed 15 in total, not to mention an 8.1% APY on invested cash. Anyways, right now, the market is showing some signs of weakness because SPY pushed all the way up to this resistance near 600 and from the double top right here. It came all the way down to 595 only to attempt to rebound. But then what happened was we are starting to show signs of establishing a lower high here. And if that's the case, this will likely continue this dip, which could lead to even more downside. So I just wanted to give you guys a warning about that. I'll talk more about this in just a minute. The market was very mixed today. We saw some stocks lead the downside, such as Tesla and Nvidia. But the overall, the overall market was more green than red. I just want to say that despite that, I don't really think that these moves may last for long because I am still seeing some weakness building. I think the market's very mixed overall. Now, tomorrow we have a very, very interesting day. Tomorrow is going to be Tuesday, November 26th, 2024. There's not really much data coming out. Just know that most of the data for the rest of the week is coming out tomorrow, not to mention on Wednesday, because the market's going to be closed on Thursday, and then Friday's only just half a day. So most of the data comes out tomorrow and Wednesday. So that's why we're seeing so much. But for the most part, these are the only things you need to worry about. At 10 o'clock a.m., we have the Richmond Fed manufacturing numbers coming out. So that's going to likely cause some volatility. And then at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have the FOMC minutes. So right after market open at 10 a.m., then 2 p.m. is when we have more volatility. So watch for that very carefully. In terms of earnings, there's not really much coming out. As a reminder, Thursday has no earnings and Friday is just half a day. So it's all very minor. But for today, we had Zoom announce their earnings. And then for tomorrow, we have Kohl's, Best Buy, Macy's, not to mention Burlington, and then Dell. Quite minor overall, but it's still going to be the most significant day of the week at the same time. This is minor compared to like an Nvidia earnings day or like Apple or something like that. But then simultaneously, this is still the biggest day of the week relative to what else is coming out. So as far as Zoom goes, just know that Zoom did relatively good for their earnings. They saw a lot of nice growth overall. When we look at the numbers right here, you guys can see that their overall revenue saw a nice increase. Their communication revenue is above expectations, growing at about 4% of 1.18 billion. Then their net income was also at 207 million or 66 cents per share. That's above from what we saw earlier last year. What's good is their full year guidance did go up for their overall earnings. We're expecting $5.41 to $5.43 for the range, which is now above expectations. At least from before. And then their overall revenue is very close to what we previously predicted. So that's not bad whatsoever. But they did raise guidance, and that's why the share price did well. Besides that, let me just double check this. Our overall numbers are not looking too bad. The market is still quite greedy, but things are shifting a bit if there is more weakness that develops. We might see this develop into a more neutral phase. Momentum is still at extreme greed, but that's starting to slow down right here, so be very careful with that. This might start to dip because of that. The put to call option ratio is now at extreme greed as buyers are back. And when we hit these extremes, that's when the market does tend to slow down because people are now starting to close shorts. They're starting to buy longs over and over and over again. It's been like that for the past week. But now the market's at some tough resistance, so this could be used as a trap. The VIX is dipping a bit. It does have a gap fill, so it is possible it dips a little bit more, but then this could be looking for a bounce once it hits its key supports. So what's my view of SPY? Let's now just focus on the charts. I'm going to be very blunt and brief with this part. We have a double top leg structure on SPY. We came up to about 601, a little bit under that. Then we came down to 595. We pushed back up to about 598, only to reject again. So I do see a risk of this dipping closer to about this 594 area. I think we might be testing that as soon as tomorrow. Might be a little bit more downside coming to SPY. It might kind of push upon open and start dipping. So there's that risk of some downside in my opinion. ES has a very similar setup. We pumped very nicely only to reject. So there is a risk of this dipping closer to about 54.98. So just keep that in mind. I think the odds favor the downside. Bitcoin's looking a little bit weaker here. We mentioned as soon as it hits 100,000, there might be a rejection. We have to reclaim at 95,000. Otherwise, it's at risk of coming down towards the 91,500 area. So I expect a little bit more downside. For Nvidia, We're looking weaker right here. We'll have to see if we could hold a 135.8. It's possible we see a small reaction to the upside because of the fact that it's at this main support. And that could also help the QQQ try to bounce a little bit, but ultimately it's still kind of weak and we do have a risk of downside because of a big double top leg structure. We have a very bearish looking candlestick right here. And because of the fact that we got this like bearish divergence that's rejecting. So we have some support at 135. We might see a little reaction to like 138, but then there's a risk of us continuing to reject and make our way down closer to like 133. 132.5 and eventually like 130 flat in that range could be coming. Overall, it looks a little bit more bearish to me. Tesla has a bearish engulfing candlestick. Unfortunately, it's looking a little bit weak. And with that happening, at least so far, there is a risk of potentially dipping lower. Tesla needs to reclaim 343 and then eventually 345 to turn back up. If we don't reclaim at least 343, we're going to be at risk of coming down to at least 327.8 and eventually fill this gap down here. So with this bearish engulfing candlestick on the daily, I think there's a risk of this kind of like pushing. We could retest 343 and then reject, or it could dip all the way down here. So I do see a risk of this being a little bit more bearish unless we hold above 343, but I think the odds favor downside a little bit more. For NQ, we look a little bit weaker. We pushed about 21,000, rejected, made a lower high. We're looking for a test of 20,820 tomorrow. If that fails us, this will be dipping back down to 20,725. If we hold this, we could attempt to rebound, but we're making lower highs here, so it could be dipping lower. For the QQQ, the QQQ is also rejecting here. So we had a high here. We came down, made a lower high. We're looking at 504 as our main support. If that rejects, we're looking for essentially 502 and then 500. I see a risk of this dipping back down to 504 below if that fails us. So watch and see how this ends up reacting. So it could reject and start dipping lower. For Apple, we pumped all the way up towards that 233 area and we rejected here. So it could be dipping closer to about 230, not to mention 229.5. We might see Apple retest 230, so be a little bit careful with this rejection that's forming. Netflix is also rejecting. I called this out last week. I said this thing is going to likely be dipping to 888 if that fails us. We're looking for essentially 850. I still think we're going to be heading down towards that. I think that the breakout area is very close to our 50 EMA. It's going to be our target back down to 847 to 850. So odds favor downside a little bit more. MSTR looks weaker here. We need to reclaim at least 418. Otherwise, we have support at 376, which is what I expect tomorrow. Look for 376. If that fails us, we dip lower towards 342. CELH or Celsius is rejecting. We need to reclaim 30. Otherwise, there's a risk of it coming back down to about 29 flats, followed by 28.73. So I expect a little bit of a move down. Supermicro did a good job at holding up, but just note this. We have one issue. We're going to be testing previous support becoming resistance, right over here. So see where this is. We had previous support right here. It's now going to be resistance. If we manage to get back above 40, this is going to be launching to about 44. If we can't hold above 40, and if the previous support becoming resistance causes us to reject, we could push towards 40, then reject and make our move back down towards 35. So keep that in mind. It's a tough resistance. Palantir has a double top leg structure, not looking that great. I do expect it to dip a little bit more to about 63.2. And we'll see if we bounce off that or not, but look for a little bit more downside. Rivian also is making like a lower high here, so it might dip a little bit towards 11.32, then eventually 11. It might be hitting the lower 11s before it tries to bounce to look for a little bit more downside. SoFi could also be dipping a little bit lower, back down to lower 15, so like 15.23 to about 15.1 in that range. So look for a little bit more downside for the lower 15s, and we'll see if we bounce or not. The IWM, we're coming back down to fill this gap. We're seeing the market slow. We have a bearish divergence developing. It needs to hold above 240. Otherwise, we're at risk of dipping closer to 236. So be careful, guys. AMD is rejecting off its 50 EMA. So this might be on its way down closer to where this gap happens to be down here. So we need to hold above 140.9. If we don't reclaim that, there's a risk of us coming down to 139. We're going to be looking for 140. If that rejects, we're looking for essentially 136. We have to hold above 140. Otherwise, we could be dipping back down for 136.6. Coin is also rejecting here. We need to hold above 308. Otherwise, 293 is going to be coming back, and there's going to be a retest in the lower level. Amazon pushed to resistance at 202. We need to break that to remain bullish for 205 plus. If 202 does not break, there is a risk of us dipping back down towards 198 or below. Meta has a double top leg structure. We need to break past 567. If it cannot break that, we are at risk of coming back down for 558. So keep that in mind. Microsoft is rejecting off our 200 EMA. We need to hold above 420. If we can't hold above that, we're at risk of coming back down to about 413 again. So it's kind of like pumping and rejecting. Google pumped very nicely. We came just short of my target of like 171. So it has to reclaim 171. Otherwise, it could push to about 170 and start dipping. If it does not hold above 170, we could be on our way back down to like 166. So we'll see how things end up going. GME is more bullish. We're going to be looking for 30 to be tested. We'll see if that breaks or not. It could test 30, and we'll have to see what kind of reaction we get. AMC pushed all the way up to about just under 5, and if we don't hold above that, we're at risk of coming back down to 4.75. DJT is very flat right now, around 30.78. If it doesn't hold above that, we could be looking back down for a dip closer to about 29. For the VIX, we are rejecting here. It might dip with the market. It might come down to fill this gap, but just know around this 14 area, we love to get bought back up. See what I'm saying? Like we hit 14 here, we bounced, 14 here bounced, 14 here bounced, 13.5 here, then bounced. So we're getting very close to that 14 area, which is where it likes to bounce, and that could be a little bearish for the markets. The 10-year is dipping with the markets, not really doing much, and so is the dollars. So I'm not really as worried about these. They're not really affecting the market as they typically do. So my view of the market's very simple. I think the market's showing some weakness. I think there's a risk of us dipping lower, and we could be looking for 594 on SPY. On the QQQ, there's also a risk of us dipping a little bit lower. We're going to be looking for a test of essentially 504. This also kind of, this could be resembling an inverse cup and handle. We'll have to see about that. So if 504 fails us, we're going to be looking for 502, then 500 as our potential targets. It also made a lower high rejection, so this could be dipping a little bit lower. Keep that in mind, guys. That's what I'm essentially seeing, at least for the way the market is moving. There are these risks of downside, especially as you look at like Tesla, which has that gap below, and that we have the bearish engulfing candle. And with the rejections forming, just be very mindful of what I'm saying. That being said, I thank you all so much for listening. The QQQ is also at risk of retesting 504 tomorrow, if not going back down to 502. I want to make this video very short and simple, so I'll be back tomorrow morning with another update. Until then, take care and peace out.